And we're back, and you're listening to SWM Radio. It was funny. This past weekend when we had camp meeting, one of the participants was telling me something about what we were just talking about this past half hour. I'm like, you understand? You get it? Because I was trying to explain this to him a while ago, and I could tell that he didn't get it quite at the time. He was still, I guess, in the system. But now he's telling me this stuff. I'm like, whoa, you're getting it. And I was, it's good to know that people get it. But you don't want people to be deceived. You want them to okay, fine, you're going to comply, but you're going to comply only to a certain level. Do what you have to do and get out. But as long as you're not breaking God's law, as long as you're not sinning in any way, I believe that God's people will see what's going on, understand it, because the Bible says they will understand. But when Satan deceives you, you can deceive into thinking you're doing the right thing down the road. I mean, this is all conditioning. So listen to this interview, and I want you to hear what's being said. See if it clears up this picture a little bit more.
So my guest today is Dr. Tom Cowan, who he's written many different books in the past before, but he's got a new one coming out as well. In the past, he wrote a book called Human Heart and the Cosmic Heart. He also wrote Vaccine Autoimmunity, also Cancer and the New Biology of Water, and a new book that's coming out called Contagion Myth. He got his undergrad at Duke University in 1977. Then he went to the Peace Corps for 2 years, then became a doctor going to Michigan State University. So with that being said, Dr. Tom Cowan, thank you so much for being a guest on Valuetainment.
Thank you, Patrick. It's great to talk to you and meet you.
Yes, feeling is mutual. So, why decide to write a book titled Contagion Myth?
That's a good question, because I have been thinking about this subject probably for 35 years, and I was hoping not to write about it because it's so controversial, and I was hoping I was done writing controversial books, but it just became clear to me that what I was seeing was so unmatched up with what I was hearing in the scientific community that I felt compelled to really look at this subject and really educate myself, and what I found felt like it needed to be written about.
So what do you write about in there that others would consider controversial?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think the real answer to that question would have to go through the history of what I found. And I hope we can talk about that, because I think through understanding the history of contagion, we understand really how we got to the present day. So if you're okay with that, I'd like to describe the history of how we got into this.
Okay, so let me pause right here.
Hola.
And Abe is with me too.
Hola.
And so the reason why we're pausing.
Dios.
The reason why we're pausing here is because notice he says, if it's okay with you, let me give you the history of how we got to where we are today. Now, I'm not sure that the interviewer picked up on that, because after hearing that, he goes straight into his agenda of what he wanted him to speak on. So we're going to follow the path that this interviewer is taking him. But notice he said, let me give you the history, but he kind of goes somewhere else. So pay attention to this.
So if you're okay with that, I'd like to describe the history of how we got into this, what I would call mess.
So can I call you Tom during the interview? Are you comfortable?
Absolutely.
So Tom, I have 4 outcomes of this interview. 4 outcomes I have in this interview based on the research I did on you, on the topics I saw you talking about in interviews. One is heart, and the reason why I want to talk to you about heart, you've spoken about that a lot, and for someone who's in business and it's a very, very high pressure type of a situation, you always hear about stress and pressure linked to heart. So I'd be curious to know what your thoughts are on that, since you've written about it and spoken about it. That doesn't have to be the first one. I'd like to talk to you about the germ theory and what we've been told over our lives, how we get germs, whether it's respiratory or coughing, and be careful. And you have different point of view on that, so I'd want to hear that as well. And then vaccine and obviously contagion myth, and some of them have to do with each other. So I think it's probably very helpful for the viewer to get an idea about the 35 years of research that you were talking about that got you to where you are today to want to write that book, Contagion Myth. So if you'd like to take the lead on that, that'd be great.
So as far as my background, I go to Duke, and I had the feeling that I should be a doctor, but sort of didn't like the whole idea. I didn't like a lot of things that I saw. And so when I graduated there, my idea was to try to do anything I could besides being a doctor. So I joined the Peace Corps and taught gardening. And interestingly, and I often say I may be the only person on earth who can say this, I'm living in a mud hut in Swaziland, and I was given the books about Weston Price and Rudolf Steiner and what they thought about nutrition and basically medicine. And it's as if a light went off to me saying the kind of doctor I didn't want to be was not the only kind of doctor there was. And that there were people who were linking food to health, and there were people linking other ways of doing medicine and other ways of seeing the human being, which I had no idea about. So then I go to medical school, and I wanted to be a family doctor. I joined a family practice residency. And then I was already, interested in natural healing and food, and I knew something about vaccines. But then I had, an experience that I would say in a way changed my life, which is about 2 months into my first year residency, I was in a clinic, and there was a child at their second DPT shot was severely injured to the point where I don't think they survived. And that was shocking to all of us, because it was very clear the baby was perfectly fine when he went in, and then had this severe brain injury, which was to the DPT shot, which was actually happening a fair amount at the time. And I said to myself, I did not go into medicine to hurt babies. But really what I saw was that really disturbed me, besides the fact that we had just hurt a baby, was that the doctors essentially lied to the parents and said there was no way this could be a vaccine reaction, even though it was very clear that the package insert, which I showed them, said that this could be a vaccine reaction. The other thing they did, which was equally disturbing to me, is they didn't report this to anybody. And so essentially from a normal statistical point of view, the people who are collecting statistics, this never happened. And then I saw this over and over again, and I started to realize that the reporting system we have and the way we communicate to patients was just really flawed. This, of course, did not endear me to my teachers, and it became very clear after my year in residency when I got my license that I just couldn't be part of this, because I refused to vaccinate the children in our clinic. And then I ended up spending the last 37 years with a practice. A lot of it in the first 20 was based on seeing children, basically all of whom were unvaccinated, many of whom got all the typical childhood illnesses. And I essentially was tasked myself with how do I treat these children? Because none of my patients would vaccinate. I wouldn't vaccinate. I probably gave 7 tetanus shots in my entire career, and essentially regret every one of those, because I didn't know what I really needed to know about tetanus.
Okay, we pause right here. Notice that he said he did not know, with all of his training and so forth, when he gave these 7 shots, or approximately 7 shots.
7 shots? Why 7 shots?
He did not know. Notice that. We're going to go right back. Watch this.
And so I had to learn how to treat these children. What I found and there's very few doctors who have that experience. I mean, that is my background. Now, I can tell you that after 35 years, as far as I know, I never had one bad outcome from a so-called vaccinatable disease. I never lost a child to measles, chickenpox, whooping cough. I saw hundreds, maybe thousands of these, and everybody was fine. And the other thing I saw is very few of my patients actually had chronic disease. So I actually was not very good at treating asthma and eczema and ADD because none of my patients had them. Now, I did get patients from other practices. They heard Tom is good at treating, chronic disease, and they were all vaccinated children, and they came to me for help with their asthma or eczema or ADD or whatever it was, but they weren't my patients originally. And so what I was seeing was two different groups of children. The one who were essentially perfectly healthy. I used to joke that I would sometimes, because I had 3 children at the time too, I would see these children and their parents at the playground, and they would say, "Oh, there's my doctor." And I would think to myself, wait a minute, I don't think I've seen this child in 3 years. And we had a good time. How are you? Oh, I'm fine, playing in the dirt. And that was my experience. Now, I think some people would say, that's sort of anecdotal, that's not double-blind studies, but I had to learn how to practice medicine in that context. And so I developed a huge repertoire of what works because I couldn't afford to be doing things that wouldn't work. And again, as far as I know, I've had no bad outcomes. Now I'm retired, so apparently I got through the whole thing, and that's my story.
So now let me ask you, while you're going through this, who was your inspiration? Because for me, when I see doctors who eventually get to your position where they look at the data and the data says over the past 50 years, rates of autoimmunity and chronic disease have exploded. Currently, 1 in 2.5 American children has an allergy. 1 in 11 has asthma. 1 in 13 have severe food allergies, and 1 in 36 are autistic or have autism, right? You have, based on the interviews, I'm not in your world, I'm not a doctor, I'm not practicing, but I've interviewed many in your world, and I've interviewed a lot of people that eventually become, a questioning vaccine. Does it seem like there are 2 types of doctors, those that become rebellious and they end up questioning everything and say, I don't know if this is the right way of doing things, and those who just kind of follow the guidelines, follow the rules, follow everything they tell them to do, and it becomes a transactional type of a doctor. But those who push the envelope a little bit, they tend to have an inspiration. Something inspired them to do that. What was your source of inspiration?
That's also a great question. My particular answer to that was, so I was pretty young too. I was, late 20s. And so what I did was try to seek out people who, it's an interesting quote from Carrie Mullis, who we may talk about later, but that there must be some wise men out there who could guide me. And so I looked in homeopathy, I looked in herbal medicine, I looked in Chinese medicine, I looked in anthroposophical medicine. And, a lot of those I would say I'm fluent in. I know how to do homeopathy. I know how to do herbalism. I know how to do nutrition. I know how to do anthroposophical medicine. But frankly, my experience was none of them really worked. And it was very, to some it may be disillusioning, but, to me, it's like I almost have no dog in the fight. Like, I'm not allied to conventional thinking, anthroposophical thinking, homeopathy, whatever. I have a child in front of me who's got chickenpox. I need them to be fine and go on their way and be, normal. And I got to figure out how to do it. And however I do that, that's not going to hurt them. That's what I did. And so essentially, I had to come up with my own system of doing medicine. And that's what I did. And that's why I wrote books.
Your own system. When you did come out with your new systems, did it ever get you in trouble? Did you ever have any issues with the board? Did they ever come out and say, hey, Dr. Cowan, you can't be doing that? Did you have any kind of experiences like that with the board?
Yeah, a little bit, but that's just normal. I mean,
okay.
That's just how it goes.
So in your world, that's normal. That's not a big deal.
No. I mean, that's what happens.
Very okay. Interesting. Keep in mind, not all of us are doctors and have the kind of experience that you have who have studied what you've studied. So for some of us, in the financial industry or in the business industry, you mix things up or you come up with something creative. You have regulators that could come out and say, you can't sell a product like that. You can't say this. I'm curious to know how you are regulated by the guidelines that you have. So,
okay, so here we see that he's not even staying on topic. He's asking him about what his influence is, or who motivated him, or how is the board treating him. This is not dealing with the topic, dealing with the issue. So, but I guess he had his questions. I guess he's following his script or whatever. But now let's see where he takes this.
Now let's go back to the book Contagion Myth, which I asked you. I said, what was the purpose of writing this book? You said, you kind of need to know my background to know why I wrote this book. Now that we know your background, what was your inspiration to want to write that book?
Basically, because I looked through the history of contagion, and if you would permit me, I'd love to share what I found out with your listeners.
Please.
So what are we talking about here? We're talking about the normal observation that a certain person gets sick in a certain way, let's say a cold or a flu, and then somebody else in their vicinity or their family or whatever gets sick in the same way. And one says something was passed between the first person and another person. And this is a very normal, clear observation. We've all had it. And in fact, interestingly, it was first described at least 2,000 years ago by the ancient Greeks. They said there's something that's passed between people. We don't know what it is. They thought the spirits or who knows what. They couldn't see anything. And then they thought there must be something contagious. And we go then for about 1,800 years without being able to find the agent. Now, I would point out that this sort of Western science, Western medicine, is not the only stream of thought going on in those 2,000 years, right? There's Chinese medicine, there's probably traditional Iranian medicine, there's Native American medicine, there's Ayurvedic medicine. These are very old, successful medical systems. And what you find is none of them thought diseases were contagious. None of them. There is no concept in Chinese medicine that something unseen passes from one person to another. And in no other system did that exist. Now, of course, that doesn't mean it's true. They could have all been wrong. But when I looked into it, I thought that was sort of interesting.
So let me jump in right here, and he's correct. First of all, we're not into the Chinese medicine. We're not into any of these things. But what he's saying is interesting that none of them had this aspect of catching disease within it. Now, they could all be wrong. So what do? You do the sciences. You do the tests. And it was the results of these tests that kind of caught my attention. And it's starting to catch the attention of people around the world now. Say, wait a minute. Do we have to rethink this thing? And to me, it makes sense because when I look at the disease of sin, how does the disease of sin work? How do people catch that? When Satan had sin within him, it wasn't like when he walked around heaven, the other angels, just by him walking around, they caught it. They caught this virus, this sin virus. That's not how it worked. So again, as it is in the physical, so it is in the spiritual. Let's see more what he's saying.
So then we get to around the 1800s, and now we're really talking about 1850. And there was what I call the first eureka moment, right? So we're thinking one person is sick, another person gets sick, there must be something spread. And that observation is what's called epidemiological observation. Now, I just want to point out something here, that this contagion theory was applied to the following disease. There was a bunch of sailors who got sick, and one sailor after another got sick, and their teeth fell out, and then they went into heart failure and died. And this happened in the thousands and thousands of people. And it was usually one ship after another. And for 100 years, they said this must be contagious. and then somebody ate a lime and the whole thing went away because it turns out it was scurvy. And the reason I point that out is epidemiological observations, like this person got sick and then somebody else got sick, is well accepted in medicine. That is not how we prove causation. And you hear this now all the time. Well, a lot of people in one place got sick, so it must be a virus. Well, they blew a bomb off in Hiroshima. A lot of people got sick and nobody thinks that was a virus. Or they'll say, if it spreads from one place to another, that proves it's a virus. So I'm sure you remember Chernobyl. There was a nuclear accident. A lot of people died. It started spreading into Eastern Europe and then Western Europe. A lot of people got sick. And as far as I can tell, that's no evidence that that was a virus. In other words, the idea that a lot of people in Iran or Turkey or Spain or the nursing home or the cruise ship or the whatever got sick, my Aunt Bessie went to a party, those are epidemiological observations, the purpose of which is to generate theories which can be tested for causation, period. And I would agree 100% that we had enough evidence with contagion that we should investigate for an infectious cause or an unseen agent. Now, that's what Louis Pasteur famously did. He said, there's all these people, and in fact, what he used was the case of sheep and said, there's all these sheep getting sick, one sheep after another. Sometimes the people who were handling the sheep got sick. So there must be something that's passed. They then had invented the microscope. So the first eureka moment in history then is they could see this bacteria under the microscope. And they saw the bacteria in the sheep, and they saw it in the next sheep who got sick. End of story. That's what caused the sheep to get sick, called anthrax. But here's what happened then. Pasteur isolated the anthrax bacteria from the sheep, right? So he took them out, and he gave them to other sheep, and none of them got sick. None of the people got sick. Now, here's the way I think people should understand this. Imagine you have a cow, and you don't feed the cow proper food, which is grass, right? You feed it cardboard and dead cow parts and you soak it in glyphosate and tick poisons, etc. All that stuff comes out in the milk. Now, then somebody drinks the milk and gets sick. That's contagion, right? And then you look in the milk and you see a bacteria called Listeria. And you say, okay, that may be the causative agent. And then you look in the stool of the person and they also have Listeria. End of story. And so the Listeria, you drank Listeria, it made you sick. Now, unfortunately though, or maybe fortunately, there's another explanation for that, which is the cow was sick, the poisons went into the milk. The role of bacteria in nature is to biodegrade poisons, right? If you have a compost pile and you put dead squirrels in it, you'll get bacteria to eat the squirrels. If you have a pond and you put poisons in it, you get algae growth that eat the poisons. If you have a forest and you cut the trees down, the algae and the fungus and the bacteria eat the dead trees. That's called biology. That's called bioremediation. So how do you know that the Listeria isn't there to digest the poisons in the milk?
I hope you're getting what he's saying. God created this, there's a scavenger system that is built in. It's like the Earth's own immune system to fight certain things. So like he says, you have a bunch of squirrels piled up, you can have bacteria to eat the squirrels. Just like algae will eat what's poisoning the water. Fungus can eat what's poisoning the trees. Well, he gave that to us also. We have that in the form of bacteria and viruses. When our tissues get poisoned or whatever, or affected, however it is affected, then this bacteria and the viruses will fight it off. The champ called them microsomas. They're also known as exosomes that will come in and fight off what is poisoning our cells. That is not the cause of the disease, it's the result because it's fighting it off. So he's saying that's just nature. That's bioremediation. So if you see bacteria in the milk, see, we're almost trained. If you see any germs in the milk, well, the germs is what made the cow sick, or the germs is what can cause sickness in whatever organic being that it is in. When the germs are actually there because there is sickness, it's there to clean it up. It's part of the scavenger system. With the earth, when there's dead meat on the ground, you have the vultures coming down and cleaning it up. If you didn't have that, the air would get toxic. So you have bacteria and viruses working as scavengers to clean up the mess. Satan doesn't want that. He wants you to get rid of whatever's cleaning it up. Stop the fever when the fever is actually working in your behalf. Stop the germ, stop the bacteria, kill it with antibiotics and so forth. And now you're going to take this stuff that has side effects, which shouldn't be in the body. Antibiotics are not part of our organic system. It is artificial, and we put this into our system to try to fight off these things. It's a screwed up system. It's messed everything up. This is why, as we get closer to these to the end days, and we see what's going on, we have to unlearn the things that we learned, because this system was created to get us to the point to where we trust in it and trust in what the government said, trust what these people are saying. It's almost like a religion. You have it's almost like the systems is like a religion, and the news media are like the priests telling you what to do, and they get their instructions from the people above who are like God to them, because it takes faith to believe in this stuff. But we have to unlearn what we've learned so we can really see and understand what's going on. Okay, going back to the talk.
So we have two very clear explanations for what may have happened, right? It's either the bacteria or it's the poison, and the bacteria are not causing anything. They're just helping you out by eating the poisons, as they do in nature. Now, what I tell people is this is what Pasteur and his colleagues did for 40 years, because there is a very simple way to sort this out. All you have to do is isolate the listeria from the milk, right? You can't give them all the milk because then you don't know if the poison's in it. Isolate the listeria, give that to a bunch of animals, see what happens. That's what they did for 40 years. And as far as I can tell from the medical literature, no animal or person gets sick.
Now,
so it must be the milk.
Yeah. So when I was looking at the difference between him and Dr. John Snow, and I'm sure you studied Dr. John Snow as well, where he had a different angle that he had. What was the difference between the two of them, between Dr. John Snow and Pasteur?
Now, I don't know who John Snow is. You mean Beauchamp?
Not Beauchamp. Dr. John Snow is also during the same time as 1850s, because I know Pasteur died 1895. During the same time, Snow was linking everything to water. So I know you're specifically isolating water, milk right now because of pasteurization. And, most of us just say pasteurization and we don't even know where it comes from. Some of us know it comes from the name Pasteur, but he was also talking about how a lot of the viruses were coming from water rather than somebody's breathing and coughing on you. That's how I got sick. It was the water. No,
I don't know this Snow, but the two main people then were Pasteur and Beauchamp.
Okay, so this interviewer goes in a slightly different direction. I'm not sure he's really getting what he just said. But I want to make sure that we get it. He said that what they did, so if you have, say, listeria in the milk, you isolate the listeria and you can put it into other organic beings and see if you can get them sick. And that's what they did for years. They take what they thought was the germ. They'll take the bacteria or whatever that is viral or whatever, and they take that and put it into a healthy, organic being and see if you can get them sick. And they could not do that. So if they couldn't get them sick, if it wasn't the bacteria, what was it? It must have been whatever poison was inside the actual milk, the milk itself. And the bacteria was there not because it was the cause of disease. The bacteria was there because it was eating it. It was eating the poisons. So it's important to understand that. And then this interviewer brings up this other guy named Snow or whatever his name is. And I never heard of him. Dr. Cowan never heard of him. But back in that time, it was Pasteur and Béchamp who were, I guess you can say, the main scientists coming up with this information. And Béchamp was the one who came up with the terrain theory, really, while Pasteur had this germ theory, and this was where the controversy was. But the world went with Pasteur. Now let's go ahead and see what more Dr. Cowan has to say about this.
Béchamp said it's not the bacteria, and it's the terrain. Now, so essentially, Pasteur and his colleagues tried for 40 years. And in fact, it's very interesting what happened then, because a German colleague named Robert Koch came up with very simple guidelines so that we would know whether a microorganism is causing a disease. And it's very simple and straightforward. They're called Koch's postulates, and they are the hallmark ever since of how we prove causation. And it's very simple. You take like 100 sheep or 100 people with the same disease, and you identify an organism that's the same in all of those 100 people, right? Here's a way to think about this. I came up with this last night. If you had a disease called swollen thumb syndrome, and so 100 people with swollen thumb, and you ask them, what happened to you? And they said, I don't know, somebody came along and bashed my thumb with a hammer, all 100 of them. Mm-hmm. So that turns out not proof. So you go to the next 100 people who don't have a swollen thumb, and you say, did any of you get bashed with a hammer? No, none of us. So that's postulate number 2. No people who are healthy have that organism, right? Because if they have it, then why didn't it make them sick? That's still not proof. Then he said, you have to take the organism from the sick people, isolate it, purify it, give it to the unhealthy people, and if they get sick, you prove causation. In other words, you take the hammer, bash 100 healthy people, and if they all get a swollen thumb, that's how human beings understand causation. Every human being would say, yes, I'm sure that the hammer is what causes that. And here's the trouble. Koch eventually said, these postulates don't work because there's not one case in the medical literature where they've proven the postulates. Not one. We've looked for 20 years. They say they do. They say they're still valid because they're common sense. I have reports even from this current episode. You know, we see epidemiology, somebody should do Koch's postulates. And then we have a report from this current situation, Koch's postulates were fulfilled. But the trouble is they never isolated an organism. They never made an animal sick, and they didn't do Koch's postulates. So that's how this got started.
Okay, so make sure you understand what he's saying here. He's saying that if you have 100 people with swollen thumbs, and they all say that when you ask them how did they get it, they all give you the same answer. Well, someone came by and took a hammer and bashed our thumbs. That's how we got swollen thumb syndrome. All right. All right. So now you've got to test this, because before this thing becomes a big deal or becomes a case or goes around the world as a pandemic and so forth, you have to test it so you know what you're talking about and what you're dealing with. In fact, how can you test for something? How can you, in other words, if you want to say someone else has this, you have to know what you're testing for. So you have to test it first. So, does that make sense? You take 100 people who do not have it and find out if any of those people had the hammer thing come down on them. They say no. All right, but that's still not proof. So what you have to do is go to the sick people, isolate what you believe caused their syndrome or caused their condition. And you take that, put it into a healthy person, and you check to see, okay, does it give them swollen thumb syndrome? If it does, then you have proven causation. The problem with a lot of the diseases that they are coming up with, even the pandemic and so forth, they have not proved causation. In fact, with the Wuhan situation, I think there was almost 270 some odd people who were sick, and they only tested like 6 or 7 of them, which makes no sense. That should be a red flag right there. And when they did, they didn't isolate a virus. They actually just found genetic material, which many believe that's what they were looking for. Because when they now do the PCR test, it's not testing for a virus, it's testing for genetic material. Anyway, just want you to get an understanding that when they come up with these diseases, you have to be able to cause or show causation by taking what was in the sick person, put it in the healthy person, and then it will cause them to be sick. By the way, when they did a lot of that, when they tested a lot of these things that they called bacteria and so forth, they could not make the other person sick. They couldn't do it. And this is what he's been saying for over 20 some odd years. They have not proved causation with a lot of this stuff that they say would be considered contagion. All right, let's continue on.
Okay, go ahead.
Go ahead.
So the next step, so they failed to prove causation with any bacteria. Then they say, well, we have diseases now which we can't find a bacteria, right? But we know that must be an infection because it looks like it's contagious. So there must be something smaller than a bacteria. And the main disease was polio. So they looked in the dead brains and the spine. They looked for a bacteria. They couldn't find it. And so they said, there must be something smaller that's poisoning these children and these people. And they called it a virus. They didn't see a virus. They didn't know what they were looking for. They just said, there must be an infectious agent. And so then they said, okay, we're going to try to isolate this because they were still interested in these Koch's postulates. And so they put it through a filter. So they had filters that could filter out the bacteria in the cells. So they took children or people who had died of polio, they ground their brains up, put it through a filter, and then they took many, many different animals and they fed them this filtrate, and none of them got sick. None of them. And then they injected it subcutaneously into monkeys, hamsters, guinea pigs, you name it. None of them got sick. And then they said something very interesting, which is, it turns out there's no animal model for polio, which is a bizarre way to think. Because what they're saying is, we cannot make an animal sick with this virus filtrate that we can't see. And then in 1907, they did the experiment that proved that polio was contagious. They took a child who had paralysis, they took a piece of their spine, they ground it up in a blender, they filtered it, and they took 2 monkeys, I think they were rhesus monkeys, drilled holes in their brains, injected about 1/2 cup of this stuff into their brains. One of the monkeys died. One of the monkeys got paralyzed. They didn't do a control. In other words, they didn't just inject 1/2 cup of, water or something. So they don't know if the monkeys died because monkeys don't like having 1/2 cup of stuff injected right in their brain. Maybe they had a herniation. And they held the monkey up and they said, see, we proved polio is a transmissible disease. Now, I don't know about you, but I can see you frowning there. That doesn't sound like science to me.
So this entire study was based on 2 monkeys?
2 monkeys. The idea that polio was caused by a filterable thing we couldn't see, right? That's the studies. Now, so we go on from there. Then we go to 1918. So now they say, we've proven that there's something filterable, right? You know, we got rid of the bacteria, we got rid of the cells. It could be a poison in there, could be arsenic, because it turns out that lead, arsenic, and DDT later caused the same symptoms as polio. And so they didn't know that, or maybe they did, but they ignored it. So they could even have had arsenic in the water. But anyways, because they didn't do a control, they have no idea, they can't find that out. So then they go to 1918, and about, 20 million people die from this Spanish flu. Highly contagious disease, right? And then, they see one person after another. And again, epidemiology is not how science proves causation. They only tell you should look here. So they did. The Boston Health Department did a study. It's referenced in the book. I can read you the conclusion if you want. They took about 100 people who had active symptoms of the Spanish flu, right? This is killing millions of people. They're snotty nose, coughing, everything. They got 100 volunteers, and they divided them into 3 groups. One group, they spent 10 minutes breathing as hard as they could into their mouth, like that, right into their open mouth, 10 minutes.
Yep.
The other group, they spent 10 to 15 minutes coughing right in their face. And the other group, they actually took mucus out of their nose, right? Sucked the snot out of their nose and injected the snot right into the volunteer's nose. These are 100 people. The Boston Health Department does this. And you know how many of these volunteers got sick? 1. He got a runny nose, which I have the quote here. I could read it to you if you want. That says, it turns out that none of these ways are able to pass the transmissible agent from one person to another. Now, you can look at that and you could say that then they came to an interesting conclusion, Patrick. They said, it turns out we needed to be more aggressive in exposing the volunteers. And I thought to myself when I read that, like what, do a lung transplant or something? I mean, how can you be more aggressive than that? They sucked the snot out and injected it. And literally one person who they said, this is not the flu, they just got a runny nose because we injected some snot up their nose.
I mean, that's pretty intense. I just want to ask something, if you can hold that thought, because 100 people were tested. This is the Spanish flu era.
1919.
1919, a third were asked to breathe 10 minutes open mouth into somebody else's face.
Open mouth.
Open mouth, strong into their face.
Kissing.
And then the other one was 10 or 15 minutes coughing into the face. And the last one was taking mucus out and injected it into the other person. And only 1 out of 100 got sick, and they had a runny nose, not even sick.
Right.
So now here's my question for you. So then, based on what you're saying is we cannot give our germ to somebody else. That's what you're saying. That's not possible. I can't give my germ to somebody else. Is that kind of what you're saying?
No, that is not what I'm saying, because that doesn't prove you can't give germs. What it proves is you can't give sickness to somebody else.
Okay, then let me question you on that. If you can't get sickness.
There's a big difference there, Patrick, right?
Perfect. That's good to know. But I again, as a parent, this is a epiphany moment I'd love to have. So I have 3 kids. You know the saying. Once one kid gets sick, everybody gets sick, right? Or, a parent gets sick when they have a baby and they have a 2-year-old kid in their house, and then they get sick. Oh my gosh, I'm sick. Now my other son is sick. Now the mom is sick. And then at night when the mom sleeps with the dad, then the dad is sick, and that kind of goes. So that kind of, that argument kind of doesn't validate what happens in a lot of families, because when kids are around other kids, they tend to get sick. What would you say to that?
I would say the same thing I would say with every epidemiological observation, right? You're talking epidemiology there. One person gets sick and then another person gets sick. The same thing that happened with scurvy, the same thing that happened with Spanish flu, the same thing that happened with anthrax, the same thing that's happened with polio. Now, you have to take that observation and prove causation of a microbe. They did that over and over again, and they cannot prove Koch's postulates. They cannot prove causation. And all I would say, now, in the book, we do propose very specific reasons why those observations might happen, right? So I can explain exactly how you can understand that event.
I'd love to hear it. Go for it. I'm all in.
I think that comes later.
Okay.
Because we still have to, you have to stick with the argument, which is you have to take that observation, right, and then isolate a virus or a bacteria and prove that it can cause that disease. They've tried that for 150 years and they can't prove it. In fact, they can't demonstrate it. So, we don't know if there's some sort of similar toxic exposure in your house, whether there's some sort of resonance phenomena, like if you put 10 young women in a cabin for 6 months, they all start menstruating at the same time. There's no virus there. So you can see physiological responses happen for lots of reasons. And in order to show that it's a microbe, you have to go through the steps. And they try over and over again. And I can keep going if you want and see how they try. And it turns out it's not the microbe. I also understand, Patrick, how bizarre this may seem to people, because they get stuck on the epidemiology. They get stuck on this observation. This observation has been around for thousands of years. Same with scurvy, same with lots of things. It turns out we have a scientific method to prove it. We looked, and it turns out that's not the cause.
So what is?
Well, I just said.
Okay, so basically he's chuckling here because he's basically saying, I said all that, and you're asking me what is, and I just kind of explained it. But hopefully this is making sense. They've tried for years to prove that the microbe, whether it's bacterial, viral, whatever, causes disease, and they could not get anybody sick. It's like they're harmless. All they do is they eat the poisons, just like just like the vultures would eat the dead meat, or they're there to clean up. They're scavengers. They're not causing any. It's their God given to keep us clean. So this is what science has seen. We're fearfully and wonderfully made. So you don't catch a cold, you earn one. With every decision that we make, what you eat, or you get enough rest, the 8 laws of health, anything that will either build up or break down your immune system. And when it goes down and the body needs help, then you have these microbes that will come out and try to help the body. They work as scavengers trying to help the body. But this is not what the medical system is based on. They will make no money with that. See, you have a microbe from outside that can hurt you even though you're healthy, then you need that vaccine. You need that the antibiotics or drugs or whatever. But if it comes from within, If the problem is the terrain and not the microbe itself, if the problem is, when I say terrain, it could be whatever it is. It could be the air, anything you ate, or whatever it is. If that is a problem and the microbes is there to help clean it out, then you don't need a vaccine or or any drugs or anything like that. What you need is lifestyle change, which is what inspiration talks about. Lifestyle change. But the enemy doesn't want you to do that. He doesn't want you to even know that. No lifestyle change. Because when you do things through lifestyle change, the way the body works and the way the antibodies work and so forth within the body, that you won't even catch those diseases again. You can get it to the point where you have antibodies for it and you don't even have to catch it. That's the way the body is designed. So that once you deal with something, the body detoxifies and it doesn't have to deal with that again. Go and sin no more. Go and sin no more. And once you get rid of sin, that's it. That's the goal. That's the design. And we can mess that up. But that is how we're created. If we were to get sick, we can be healed, and we can be healed in such a way where we wouldn't even have to deal with that anymore. That's what God wanted for us. But he didn't want us to get sick in the first place. But if it did happen, we're fearfully and wonderfully made with how it is treated. Okay, just a little bit more.
Basically, these phenomena are elimination of toxins. So the trouble is we're skipping ahead here. And I would rather go back and see how the virus theory actually came about.
Here's what I'd like to challenge you to do. My challenge to you would be, try to explain it to a 6-year-old to understand, who's not in your world and doesn't fully understand all the technical terms. Speak to me as if the average person is listening to this saying, you know what, doc, I really want to learn, but I don't understand how this is even possible if, based on what I've experienced and what I've been told my entire life with visiting doctors, this is what I've seen. So if you can explain that and pack it into a fairly short amount of time to the best of your abilities, I'd love to hear that perspective from you.
So here's some facts about what we're calling a cold or a sickness, right? So essentially what happens is you're well, and then you usually get a fever or some other symptom. And then after that, what happens is you get a runny nose or mucus or cough or some sort of snot happens. And then what happens is you're better. And in fact, when we do the studies of what happens, for instance, with a child with chickenpox, right? So child with chickenpox, once they go through those stages, it turns out they're better for life, meaning they have less asthma, they have less eczema, they have less cancer, they have less osteoarthritis, they have less heart disease. All these are clearly in the medical literature.
Okay, see what he just said? This basically lines up with what the spirit of prophecy is saying. In other words, a child is sick with chickenpox, go through the stages, the antibodies are built and so forth, change their lifestyle also when it comes to certain things, and you're better for life, not just with that one disease, but with asthma and so everything else. When we keep the 8 natural laws of health, it fixes a lot of things, not just one disease. A lot of things. That is how fearfully and wonderfully made we are. Okay, continuing.
Now, here's another one, and I wrote a whole book on the cancer about this. It turns out that the most reliable way to treat cancer, and this was done with Coley's toxins, and it was done in the 1920s, is if somebody has cancer and they get a fever because they supposedly have an infection, then they have a much better outcome, and some of them are even cured of the cancer. In other words, this process that you're calling getting sick is simply a detoxification reaction. So in other words, you poison somebody with whatever. It could be emotional poison, it could be bad food, it could be toxins in the house, It could be that we're all exposed to glyphosate. It could be that we're all exposed to electromagnetic fields. All of these things distort the gels in our cells, and then the body has to flush them out. It does this through making fever, making mucus. We call that infectious disease, and it turns out it's just a detoxification reaction. And the thing about it is when you treat it like that, you get people who have no bad outcomes and are better for life. That's what's happening. Now, there's something even very interesting about this, because we now know from very clear scientific studies that if you poison a cell or a tissue, it breaks down into little packages of genetic material, which are called exosomes, as a method of detoxification. In other words, it's similar to how a tree does. If you have beetles eating a tree, they send out signals to tell all the other trees that there's been something happening that's noxious in their area. And then the other trees make a defensive response. Now, I'm aware that this may be more than a 6-year-old can do, but I'm trying my best to be as clear as I can here. So what's happening then is one child starts the process, and then they send out this signal to the other children and even maybe the parents: you should make a defensive detoxification reaction. Unfortunately, we misinterpret that as sickness. We even misinterpret that the body makes these detoxification packages that are called exosomes, which are mistaken for viruses, and they're not contagious, they're not infectious, they're how the body communicates what's happened and detoxifies.
Okay, so let's stop right here, because I'm hoping that you get the principle. Because everything that we do is based on principle, at least it should be, right? And when he mentioned the trees, beetles eating off of trees, signals sent through the ear, the other trees become defensive. I learned years ago that trees communicate with each other through vibrations in the air and so forth, however that works. I'm not a tree. But to know that that's how God created them. But scientists have discovered that they communicate to each other through their way. Same way when women get together and they live under the same roof for a while, whatever the situation is, sometimes their cycles can almost synchronize and so forth. Why that happens or how that happens and so forth. All of that is part of nature. So also in nature with us, what God has packaged within us, something called exosomes. Now, when the body doesn't need them, they turn into something very positive. In fact, from what I understand, they help the body in creating vitamin B12. But when the body is in distress, or when the body has had some type of injury or insult, however it comes, whether it's through asthma or whatever the situation is, even stress and fear, flu, and all of these things, these exosomes will present themselves either as bacteria or something viral to help clean the body out. Now, and help the body to detoxify. Now, this is key for us to understand spiritually, because in one day when we are standing, or when we are being tested and we go through persecution, that is a spiritual, think about it, a spiritual detoxification. Whenever your body goes through a detoxification, it doesn't feel good. Right? It does not feel good. Neither will persecution. But it needs to happen so that we can be perfected and get to the point where we will sin no more, where we be perfected. And the body goes through a spiritual detoxification. And when you take a piece of gold and you put it in the fire, that fire will cleanse it Persecution will help cleanse, but it's going to make you humble as you've never been before. We'll be holding on to Jesus Christ. Like Jacob held on to the angel and said, I will not let you go till you bless me. Satan is reminding us of all of our past sins. We realize that we are nothing. We are nothing. And it's a humbling experience, but it detoxifies you spiritually. Now this is deep, and it gets deeper, but we're out of time. We're out of time, so let's just stop it right here. Let's have a word of prayer. Father, please help us to understand your ways and help us to understand as it is in the physical, so it is in the spiritual. These are your words, not mine. This is in the Bible and spirit of prophecy. Help us to better understand the principles in which you created our wonderful bodies. This way we can't be deceived, especially as we keep our eyes focused on Christ. Help us to make that our goal. Go before us and lead, guide, and bless us in every way. Help us to be all that you would have us to be. Please hear and answer this prayer. We thank you so much in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. So again, we share this with you because we're all brothers and sisters, and we're all working together so that we can stand at the end. Amen. All right. So coming up, here's Abe. Coming up at next will be Pastor Bowen, and he has the daily
Briefing.
The daily briefing. And Abe, is there something else you would like to add?
Yeah, and I want to add and talk about the AM Play channel for our kids 2 and up.
Okay, 2 and up. Okay.
Somebody maybe just 80.
Thank you so much for spending time with us here in the morning program. We look forward to seeing you again next time. And thank you for listening to SWM
Radio.